I think it's time for Justin Trudeau to put the question to Canadians. Do we really think he's prime ministerial material? Some of us never did. Or is he a failed radical ideologue who has driven our country into the ground in ways many of us could never even have imagined 10 years ago? We need an election now. Go to calltheelection.ca, sign the petition.
Canadians don't want elections. They just want us to do the job. They just want us to govern. And that's what we're doing. We're governing.
Why do you think people don't like you?
We took a very different choice in 2015 than the United States did in responding to the challenges the middle class is facing. They voted for a populist in Donald Trump, but Canadians voted for someone who's going to roll up their sleeves and deliver.
If an early snap election isn't called, Canadians will continue to have to live under Justin Trudeau's hypocrisy, financial mismanagement, wacko dangerous drug policy, radical immigration theories, extremist environmental regime, and they'll do it all in crime-plagued cities. The last thing the Liberals want right now is an election. Why? Because all the polling data shows they're going to lose and lose bigly. In fact, Trudeau's Liberals have already delayed the October 2025 election by 1 week to make sure that many of their loser outgoing Liberal MP alumni qualify for their pensions. And the Liberals are getting away with all of this thanks to the enabling of Jagmeet Singh's new Democrat Party, who need the same pensions.
Mr. Singh, for the good of the country, are you going to walk away from your multi-million-dollar pension?
No media's allowed. No media's allowed.
Now, the Conservatives, who are surging in polling across all demographics, are going to smoke Trudeau in an electoral victory, the likes of which we haven't seen since the Liberals beat Kim Campbell. The Conservatives want a carbon tax election.
Precedented threat from President Trump's potential tariffs. And what is the state of things here in Canada? Our economy is weakened. Our borders are weakened. Our military is weakened. And most of all, our Prime Minister is weakened. Why can't we have a carbon tax election so Canadians can choose a leader with the brains and backbone to protect our economy and put Canada first?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, while the Leader of the Opposition focuses on himself and on me, we're staying focused on Canadians.
Trudeau's escalating quasi-sales tax on being alive and producing things in this country is crushing Canadians when we need fossil fuels to heat, to eat, to move, and to sustain us. Yet Trudeau punishes us for it. Maybe you're not convinced, though. Maybe you even like the carbon tax. Maybe you're amongst the statistical rounding error of green zealots who think that taxes change the weather. Okay, fine. Let me then give you a bunch of other reasons why we should call the election now. Maybe a carbon tax election is not for you. Maybe you want a food bank election.
After a once-in-a-century pandemic, global inflation, and now wars in both Europe and the Middle East, along with the increasingly dire costs of climate change, Canadians need their government to do more, to give them a leg up, to have their backs. That's why we're launching Canada's first ever national school food program, a program that'll feed 400,000 more kids every year.
Maybe you want an affordability election because you're being crushed by government spending-induced inflation.
The challenge we're facing right now is that the direct pressures on individuals and households, the affordability crisis, being kicked in the teeth by inflation around the world over the past few years, the concerns around the rapid pace of change, the instabilities we're seeing, the shifting geopolitics, the disruptions of the supply chain, have a lot of individual citizens, voters, families really worried that they're not able to make ends meet. And it's really, really easy when you're in a short-term survive. I got to be able to pay the rent this month. I got to be able to buy groceries for my kids, to say, okay, let's put climate change as a slightly lower priority. And that's something that's instinctive. When the storm comes, you want to hunker down and just sort of huddle up and wait for it to blow over. We can't do that around climate change.
Maybe you want a euthanasia election because you're so appalled that Justin Trudeau's government has euthanized what amounts to a mid-sized Canadian city of vulnerable Canadians who could not get access to timely health care to ease their suffering. Maybe you want a housing election because you're a millennial or a Zoomer who realizes that in Justin Trudeau's Canada, a 600 square foot human aquarium of a condo can cost $750,000 in some cities.
While the rest of the West is mostly closing its borders, Canada will welcome some 1.5 million people from 2023 through 2025. This should be something to celebrate, but instead, a deep resentment is taking hold in Canada. Why?
Okay, that makes for a good headline, but it's not accurate.
Maybe you want a Jasper wildfire election.
Jasper was one of the most fire-smart communities in the country. Over the past years, residents and leaders within Jasper have been exemplary in making sure they were doing everything they could to protect their community. This fire, Mr. Speaker, was a treetop fire. It jumped from treetop to treetop and through flaming pine cones kilometers ahead of it, which is what set this burn. This is a result of climate change, Mr. Speaker.
Because maybe you're tired of the federal government choosing nature over people and mismanaging our natural resources to the point where 1/3 of a UNESCO World Heritage Site burned to the ground on the Liberals' watch. Maybe you want a capital gains election because you're a family farmer or a business owner who doesn't think that the government should scoop up what you've worked so hard to build because of the government's neo-Marxist eat the rich mentality.
I've heard a lot of wealthier people say, oh, you're raising my taxes, we're going to be investing less. The problem with the argument they're making, because they don't want to make slightly smaller profits in order to ensure that young people are successful, the problem with the argument they're making is capital gains have changed many times over the past few decades.
Maybe you want an emissions cap election because what the Liberals are proposing as a emissions cap is really not an emissions cap at all, but a cap on oil and gas production, which is a cap on Western Canadian well-paying jobs, which will ultimately drive up the cost of energy for everybody else in the country. Maybe you want an immigration election because while you're pro-controlled and orderly immigration, Justin Trudeau's brand of unrestrained, uncontrolled, and illegal immigration has driven up the cost of housing, driven up healthcare wait times, and driven down Canadian wages.
Over the past few years, we've seen a massive spike in temporary immigration, whether it's temporary foreign workers or whether it's international students in particular that have grown at a rate far beyond what Canada has been able to absorb.
Maybe you want a hypocrisy election because you're tired of being told that you need to cut corners or cancel your Disney Plus subscription and not go on a family road trip because you're being taxed through the nose to fight global emissions, while Justin Trudeau and his merry band of ministers gallivant across the world to be keynote speakers at events that could have amounted to a Zoom call. Maybe you want a corruption election because you're tired of well-connected Liberal elites and even Liberal MPs using government programs and procurement contracts like the so-called Green Slush Fund and the Indigenous procurement process to line their pockets while you get stuck holding the bill.
After 8 years, this NDP Liberal government isn't worth the cost. The Liberal-appointed chair of the Green Slush Fund resigned in disgrace after it was revealed that she funneled more than $200,000 of taxpayers' money into her company. An independent report reveals that this just scratches the surface of corruption at the foundation. So how many more Liberal insiders have used the Green Slush Fund to line their pockets?
Maybe you want a public safety election because you want police to focus on the rising crime in Canadian cities, and you want to change to Justin Trudeau's catch and release bail policies, while Justin Trudeau tells the police to focus their ire on law-abiding Canadian gun owners, angering both the gun owners and the police. Maybe you want a pretendian election because you're tired of Liberal elites claiming Indigenous heritage out of thin air to advance their political or financial aspirations.
A company once owned by Minister Boissonnault is under investigation by Edmonton Police on fraud allegations. There are questions about that company and his connection to that company. He recently had to apologize for appearing to claim indigeneity. Can you explain to Canadians then who've been reading all these reports why you still have confidence in Minister Boissonnault.
Minister Boissonnault has addressed these and will continue to answer directly for those. In the meantime, I'm happy that he is continuing to lead on issues around jobs and employment and represent Alberta in our government.
Later today, Minister Hajdu is going to testify at a Commons Committee on Indigenous procurement programs. One of the issues that's being raised is some companies are falsely claiming indigeneity in order to access these procurement programs. That gets us to the whole issue of pretendians, people or companies trying to falsely claim Indigenous status. As someone committed to reconciliation, I wonder what you make of this phenomenon that companies seem to want to pretend to be Indigenous.
The question of identity is an extremely delicate one for the federal government to weigh in on. It is much more important that Indigenous communities themselves make determinations around the framework and the rules they have, and we will continue to work with them on those.
Maybe you want a drug policy election because you think it's absolutely wacko to be legalizing hard drugs when people need help to get clean so that they can reclaim their dignity and return to their families. Maybe you want a tariff election because you're worried that Justin Trudeau's insane and ideological resistance to abandon his bad immigration and public safety and drug policies will prompt incoming President Donald Trump to slap tariffs on Canadian goods, costing Canadian jobs.
One of the really important things is that we be all pulling together on this. The Team Canada approach is what works. That's where, putting aside partisanship, that's where I reached out immediately to Doug Ford to agree with him that we would have a First Minister's meeting this week to talk about the United States. Talked with François Legault and some other premiers as well. There's work to do, but we know how to do it.
Maybe you want a vibe election because you're tired of your inept weirdo finance minister twitching like she's being electrocuted every time she gets near a podium and saying stupid things like we're not in a recession, we're in a vibe session. Maybe you're tired of having a finance minister who thinks you're not low on cash, you're just low on the vibes.
A lot of economists have been talking about the vibe session and the fact that Canadians just aren't feeling good and that is having real economic consequences. And the Canadian economists making that point are right.
Maybe you want a free speech election because you're tired of Justin Trudeau's censorship and you're tired of being told through a series of totalitarian North Korean-style pieces of legislation that there's only one way to think, and that's like a liberal.
It's been a word you've used many times, so how do you decide what's misinformation and when to use this word since the word can encompass different ideas amongst Canadians? Thank you.
Unlike all of you in this room, or most of you in this room, I never studied political science. I studied English literature. So words really matter to me. And you may call me old-fashioned, but I tend to defer to the actual definitions of words when I use them. And misinformation and disinformation, which you used a little interchangeably, are actually very different things. Disinformation is when things that are false, things that are untrue, are spread by people who don't know any better. Misinformation is a deliberate choice to spread and share falsehoods for a particular purpose, whether it's a personal purpose or a political purpose or a creating chaos purpose.
Maybe you want a parliamentary gridlock election because you want the federal government and the MPs who occupy it to turn over evidence of their own corruption to the RCMP so that the House of Commons can get back to the work we pay them to do. I could go on.
Question was about the Prime Minister's $1 billion green slush fund scandal. We already know while he forces 2 million Canadians to a food bank and doubled housing costs, is quadrupling the carbon tax, he has a $1 billion fund that whose own bureaucrats say reminds them of the sponsorship scandal, whose executives give money to their own companies. Yesterday, a courageous whistleblower testified the Prime Minister's innovation minister lied, and I quote, lied to the committee. Why is this minister and his boss, the Prime Minister, covering up this scandal and waste of Canadian tax dollars?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Not surprised.
surprising that the Conservative leader doesn't want to talk about his failed Republican-style plan to shut down Parliament last week. All his 30-hour temper tantrum achieved was to show Canadians the party's true colors and cost Canadians $2 million in wasteful spending.
Maybe I'll give you just one more example. Maybe you want a religious freedom election because you're tired of Justin Trudeau using federal funding and charitable status to manipulate Christians and pro-life organizations into attesting to the values of the Liberal Party.
Today we're moving forward on important legislation focused on pregnancy crisis centers to make sure that women get the right information about the services and support that they need when they're making important life choices. We're always going to be there as a government, as a party, to stand up for women's rights, for women's reproductive rights, and push back against anyone who's trying to take those rights away.
Did you find a reason on my list, which could have obviously been much longer, to ask Justin Trudeau to call an election? If you agree with me, go to calltheelection.com and sign the petition. Let's see if we can make this the biggest petition in Canadian history, because I think everybody's got a reason right now for Justin Trudeau to call the election. For Rebel News, I'm Sheila Gunn Reid. If you agree with me that there has never been a better time or more reasons for Justin Trudeau to call the election, go to calltheelection.ca and sign the petition.